You're listening to Mark of the Maker. Hey everybody, I'm Mark Steiner and you're listening to Mark of the Maker, and this is episode 63 of the show. This one's going to be another interview, another interesting person that we're very thankful took the time to chat with us. Some of you may be familiar with this person already, or maybe have even heard him on another show, but we're going to dig into things a little bit and hopefully have a good conversation. Let's make sure we have the usual crew here with us. We have Mr. Michael Birch.
Here.
And we have Mr. Sean Kendrick.
Hey, hey.
And we have Mr. Tom Crine.
Hey, guys.
All right. Well, we might as well get right into it. We got lots to talk about. So our guest this time for episode 63 is a gentleman named Larrin Thomas. And Larrin has a website called knifesteelnerds.com. I think it's safe to describe as an expert in knife steels and metallurgy. And we probably won't have an exam, Larrin. We may or may not have prepared examination material, but we'll try not to.
An exam for me or an exam for you?
I hope not for me.
Yeah, right. We're going to do poorly if it's from you. So, Larrin, thanks.
I've been studying.
Okay, Tom's taking the exam. We'll all just watch from afar with popcorn. All right, so Larrin, thanks for joining us. Welcome to Mark of the Maker.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Okay, well, fellows, just start at the beginning, kind of talk about where Larrin grew up. That's usually our normal MO with the guest, is dig into teaching us about your background, help people understand who you are.
Okay. Oh, I was born in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Yeah?
Oh, my parents both grew up there. My dad, of course, is Devin Thomas. He's known for making Damascus steel, pattern welded Damascus steel, and kitchen knives. So growing up, I was always around knives and Damascus. Oh, I think my dad made his first Damascus before I was born. I was born in 87. He was making Damascus in 86.
Oh, wow.
His first stainless Damascus in 91. So he was one of the first people to make stainless. Definitely one of the first people to sell it at any volume. As you know, the focus in Damascus has always been pretty simple, low alloy carbon steels. So, but the stainless steel was very popular with, stock removal makers. So, ABS bladesmiths, they're normally using low alloy simple steels, but for folder makers, stainless Damascus was a big product.
Do you have any idea what caused that to come around at that time? What made him want to do that, and what was the impetus for stainless Damascus being around at all?
Well, he grew up making knives. He made his first knife, I think, in his early teens, like 12 or 13. And he worked for a knife maker named Bob Lofgreen in Arizona when he was 16, 17. So he'd been making knives for a while. He went on a proselytizing mission to Japan, and so he was always interested in the knife and sword related things that were there. And when he came back to the States and got married, he kept making knives. And he was a good knife maker. He's still a good knife maker. But his Damascus would sell really well. So, he was interested in knives and steel. And so I don't know exactly why Damascus. I mean, in the 80s, there was a lot of mystique about Damascus. It'd been somewhat recently repopularized. And so I think, he saw Damascus and thought he could make it.
Interesting. The stainless piece, I think, is where Michael was going with it. Do you know what drove that particular aspect of it? I know obviously that was a few years later, but...
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I mean, stainless is a natural evolution in some ways. I mean, the market had been moving to stainless and stock removal knives, ATS 34, 154 CM were popular, 440C before then and during that time period. So, people want a knife that's easier to maintain. So, he started doing experiments on stainless. I know we talked to Wayne Goddard some about steels he might try, and he gave some suggestions. But yeah, I don't know if I know much more than that. So he was able to make stainless, and it was popular.
Yeah. Like you said, it seems like a natural progression, right? I mean, I know when I got into knives, I absolutely had, I won't call it a fear, but some level of aversion to carbon steels just because they seemed less carryable to me, which wasn't really fair. I came to realize over time, but they certainly required more care and feeding than I was willing to put into them. And so for me, it was always like, oh yeah, stainless Damascus, that's where I need to be because I didn't want it, to rust and whatever. And
well, and in a perfect world, we'd have stainless steels that have the same properties we want in non-stainless. That's just as easy to work with, and so the customer gets the best of everything. But there are some people that just prefer carbon steel for the traditional nature of it. Certainly, it's typically easier to forge, which is part of why it's very popular with forging bladesmiths. But yeah, I mean, if you've got a choice between two similar steels, one is stainless and one isn't, then might as well go stainless.
So you were around this stuff from the time you were born, basically, right? This was just like what Dad did.
Yeah, I have no memory of like my first experience with a knife or the first time I learned about custom knives or Damascus. That was just something I always knew about. I remember my dad leaving every morning to go to work when we were in Vegas. When we moved to Panaka, the shop was in the backyard, so there was almost no separation between home and shop. So yeah, it was always around. It was always in the air. People would visit our house. My dad would leave for knife shows or hammer-ins. So just, knives were a part of life.
Were you taking an interest in that, or did you go to any of the shows as a younger man, or?
Yeah, the first thing I remember was a hammer-in when I was around 12 or so. We went to a Montana hammer-in at Rick Dunkerley's, I believe. So that was some of my first exposure outside of just my dad. I don't remember being super interested in what was going on. I mean, I was 12, so I didn't really know what was going on. They were doing demonstrations on forging steel and talking about things. My dad demonstrated on some Damascus patterning techniques. We went on a big drive up to Montana, so that was exciting. At the time, they didn't have speed limits, so we were really excited to go 85 on the highway. Yeah, and then I know it went so well bringing me that my dad then brought my brother, and my brother did not do as well on the trip as I did. Apparently, he had some traveling issues. So, so I was a pretty good kid, pretty quiet. I'm an introverted nerd, as you can tell from what I now focus my time on. So I was a little bit easier to handle than my brother, I think. Then in my teens, my dad started taking me to some knife shows. So the first one I went to was probably the Vegas show, maybe the Eugene show. Also went to Blade Show a couple times as a teenager or in my early 20s. And the knife shows were really when I started to develop my own interest in what was going on. Because at the hammer-ins, they were mostly fun events where people would share information. And, there was good camaraderie and everything. There was nothing negative about those experiences. But it was at the knife shows when I really saw the big sales pitches from the knife makers, when they're saying like, oh, I've got this super steel or this amazing heat treatment, or my knives cut 3 times longer than the other guys. I have a special forging process, whatever it was. That stuff was all intriguing to me. I remember a guy had a fillet knife and, he was bending it 90 degrees and saying that he had this special steel. And I was like, well, just tell me what it is. I can go look it up and I can read about it. And he's like, no way. I'd never reveal what the steel is in my special fillet knife. And I was like, dang it.
Probably L6.
So yeah, it was probably something lousy or maybe so not lousy, mysterious. But just common or generic probably. And just he assigns a special label to it. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of that is advertising that continues to this day with people advertising their secrets that they'll never tell anyone, and buyers will buy into it. It's surprising, but so I'd ask my dad a lot of questions like, Dad, tell me about the special steel that are in these fillet knives, or stuff like that. Or some people were asking me how you make stainless Damascus. Dad, tell me the secret. I'll never tell. And so I was interested in all that. And my dad was relatively knowledgeable. He liked to learn about steel and metallurgy. He needed to know some to be able to make his Damascus and anneal it properly, and tell people how to heat treat, or how to troubleshoot their issues with his Damascus, that kind of stuff. And Dr. John Verhoeven is a relatively well-known metallurgist in the knife community because he worked with Al Pendre on Woots, and he also wrote a book on steel metallurgy for knife makers. He was sending some sample chapters of his book to my dad because it wasn't published yet. So he was sending to a handful of knife makers to get feedback, like, did this make sense, or this needs more explanation, that kind of thing. So I was reading those sample chapters. I was asking my dad a lot of questions, and that was like really when I first got interested. And I joined a couple knife forums and was active on those. Talking about steel and Damascus and heat treating. And so I was interested pretty early on. I was arguing about whether or not S30V was chippy, which was a popular topic in the early mid 2000s.
Okay. Just while you're on that, do you think that the early S30V was kind of a little more brittle, or people didn't know how to treat it?
I'm not sure exactly. I mean, the heat treatment that they recommended isn't 100% optimal, but I don't know if it really lead to chippy behavior. S30V was more wear resistant than a lot of previous steels used by those companies like Spyderco, Benchmade, Kershaw. I don't know exactly whose knives were the chippiest or who was treating them badly, but maybe they were grinding them poorly because it was more wear resistant. Maybe they were heat treating them badly. I mean, there's always been the recommendation to factory knife buyers that you need to sharpen a knife a few times before it really, starts cutting right, because they might grind the edges poorly or overheat them a bit. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with S30V. I think the composition itself is pretty interesting. And so, yeah, I don't know exactly what was happening. That reputation has mostly gone away.
Yeah.
I don't know if S30V is that sexy anymore. 20 years old, it might as well be 100 to some of the buyers. So it's not old enough to be 52-100, and it's not new enough to be exciting to the collectors. So it's kind of in a middle zone now where it doesn't have many fans. But S30V was one of those steels that got me excited because, at the time they were advertising how it's this new steel developed just for knives. And I was talking to the crucible metallurgists at the show and, pestering them with all kinds of questions about the property comparisons between different products and how much better is S30V and why can't you make stainless 3V? And those were all exciting to me.
I remember those arguments and the talk and owning some of the very early S30V blades. And I always wondered if it was a product of us coming off of using more carbon steel and quote unquote softer steels that made it seem chippy, or if it was just actually, new heat treating or whatever. I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, and I even talked to Dick Barber, who was the main metallurgist who developed S30V, and asked him about that. Maybe Crucible investigated some blades or recommended changes or something. But he didn't seem to know either, so I've never gotten to the bottom of that one.
Interesting. Were you into like the art of the knives at all, or was it just the steel that intrigued you?
My main interest in terms of knives themselves was mostly in Damascus. Like how cool you could make mosaic Damascus or different patterns, and early on when I'd get on forums, I would just go in the search and type in Damascus and just read every thread where people were discussing Damascus. Because, obviously I was around a lot of Damascus. So I was interested, like what do people say about my dad? Like who's making cool new stuff? Who were up and coming people? So I was really interested in Damascus. The other one was kitchen knives. Now, kitchen knives are huge now, but in the mid 2000s, there was almost none. I remember trying to find an American maker to make me a kitchen knife, and I had fewer than 5 maybe to choose from. And there were some Japanese makers that would come to shows and sell stuff. Murray Carter was around, but now there's been an explosion. But my dad was also into kitchen knives, which I think is where some of my interest came from. But the cool thing about kitchen knives is that everybody uses one. And also, they perform really well when they've got nice thin edges. And so, when I was going to shows and there was just nothing but tactical folders with these fat edges on them that could hardly cut anything, the kitchen knives were much more interesting because I knew I'd actually use one and that if you made it right, it was nice and thin. Kitchen knives and Damascus were my interests early on.
Yeah, it's really hard to hide a bad heat treat or bad edge geometry on a kitchen knife.
Oh, yeah.
It'll get found out real fast.
Yeah, and in those times also, some people would try to transition into making kitchen knives, and guys used to making hollow ground folders, moving to kitchen knives. They really didn't know what they were doing, a lot of them. So I'm glad we've evolved quite a bit since then. There's a lot of good kitchen knives available now.
Yeah, an explosion, right? Like its own crazy, almost, I was going to call it mini industry, but I would call it super industry. Seems like a ridiculous number of kitchen knife makers nowadays.
Good ones too, not just, some quality stuff.
Yeah, and why did it take so long? I have no idea. It seems so obvious. Kitchen knives were big commercially, like Ginsu knives or Cutco or whatever. They were everywhere. But it seems like it was all about, forged buoys and hunting knives. Why didn't they branch out?
I think they weren't bringing the money until the Kramer fellows started getting big money. And money gets everybody in.
Yeah.
And I don't think they were really sexy either at the time, everybody was into the big Morans and the survival knives and stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which, like you said, Larrin, is kind of opposite of probably what it should be, right? Because, I own lots and lots of knives, but certainly the ones I use most are the kitchens by far, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's, little basic, simple pocket task kind of stuff, but, man, every day I got a kitchen knife in my hand making something.
Yeah, but like Don Carlos, he's been doing kitchen knives for a long time and making them pretty, and I remember seeing some that I should have bought, that people would go and rush to buy the tactical folder or whatever and then kind of leave but not anymore. That stuff goes quick.
Yeah.
I also think that this is just my thought. Maybe I think kitchen knives, to do them properly, it's more difficult than it would seem.
Yeah.
It's easier to build an overbuilt knife that the blade isn't, 10 thousandths or less at the edge and flexes when you flat grind it. And, those big 2-inch flat grinds, they're not as fun as they would seem.
Yeah, there's a whole skill involved with that. A lot of steel to grind, a lot of surface area to finish. The percentage of blade versus handle is a lot different, like you said, and trying to grind a really thin edge without burning it is, you got to figure out how to do it.
Larrin, do you think that your dad, do you think of your father as a more technical knife maker? I would guess so, based on, being a earlier Damascus guy and being kind of sort of a reference guy in the industry. Would he consider himself a technical guy or more of a School of Hard Knocks guy?
Yeah, I don't know if those are the categories to choose from necessarily. He's definitely a technically minded person. He's a very intelligent person. That's how he was able to figure out how to build that business from scratch.
Right.
And there wasn't really that much of a business model out there to copy. Since my dad, there's been Damascus makers that took his business model and ran with it, once the template was there. But he didn't have much competition when he started. I mean, there was Daryl Meyer and maybe one or two others. But even what they were doing was different than the direction my dad went in. He would surface grind his bars and etch them so you could see the pattern before you bought it, for example. And, it just had a lot cleaner look to it. And he focused a lot on very repeatable patterns. So, as opposed to guys just putting out random pattern Damascus, he had consistent patterns that would look similar no matter how much you ground into it, for example. And so the quality was there. And so he'd show up at a show and he'd have all these beautiful flat ground bars, with the pattern visible. But I'm getting off topic. So yeah, he is a technical person, but I don't think, you have to describe him as creative also. I mean, he developed quite a few Damascus patterns that continue to be copied. I think his spirograph pattern is really amazing example of simplicity in patterning leading to complexity in the final design. I think his faults are that he gets bored. So when you have a Damascus business, you've got to be pumping out these same bars of steel day in and day out. Right. And his skills are in creativity and in development. So, making new patterns, figuring out how to make stainless Damascus, making new combinations of steels, that's really where he shines and where he had a big leg up on the competition. He was leading the pack for years there, making stainless Damascus when no one else would, or putting new combinations of steels, new patterning techniques. And I think what he did was very impressive, especially considering his age. I mean, he was making Damascus full time when he was younger than me. So, in like his mid-20s or so, he had a successful business.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. I was kind of thinking about it in context of your own journey and we're going to get into the rest of that story. But, I was thinking, is Larrin a technically focused guy? Maybe is that something that came from your father or from your mother? Like, where did that come from? And it sounds like it was just there from very early on for you as far as your interests go.
Yeah, I mean, I just followed what was interesting to me, and I'm a nerdy, maybe science or technical minded person. And so my dad is too in some ways. So he was there to talk to me. I mean, if I had a more, I don't know how to say it in a non-derogatory way, but, like a more cowboy type knife maker dad, it's just like, well, this is how we make them, son. Then it wouldn't have fed into it as much. If I would ask my dad, like, oh, Dad, tell me, like, why are these guys saying 154 is better than 440C? And he would just say, I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't have fed my interests and led to anything. So I definitely think it helped that I had my dad to bounce ideas off of. Because, when you get on the forums and people are just arguing about stuff, and you don't really know who to believe, it's nice to have a somewhat authoritative person to go to and ask questions. And my dad mostly knew his stuff. I definitely think he was in the top 5 or 1% when it comes to the knife community on his knowledge on metallurgy and steel and things. So, even when he got a couple things wrong, probably, he was mostly right and could steer me in the right direction. But I do think my personality is also just, nerdy, engineering, science. Those things were all interesting to me. So just I went where my interests were.
Right. No, that makes sense.
Larrin, I want to kind of circle back a little bit. I think we skipped a little bit. You mentioned you were born in Las Vegas, and then you mentioned later that you lived in, is it Panaka? Panaka?
Mm-hmm.
What was the timeline there? When did you move to Panaka?
When I was 8 years old, we moved to Panaka, so that was around 95.
So you're pretty young still, and that's a pretty big change from big city Las Vegas to Panaka, right?
Yeah, it was a big change for me. I had a couple of really good friends in Las Vegas. I was really sad to leave. though I was in third grade, I remember we were doing a unit on Oregon Trail, which I thought was really cool. And my teacher was saying that she was like sending for some kind of packages where we would get stuff about Oregon Trail, like, I don't know, little souvenirs or like a packet of information. I couldn't wait to get this packet on Oregon Trail. So these are more examples of how I'm a nerd.
It's probably just dysentery.
Yeah. Just dysentery in a box.
Right.
Oh, yeah, we moved to Panaka. I never got that packet. And then I remember a couple years later, we were back in Vegas. We were going to some kind of like county fair or something. And I was able to see one of my friends there. I was like, oh, man, I really need to know what was in that Oregon Trail packet. And his answer was, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So, yeah, Panaka, it was a big jump because it was a big city. I mean, we weren't like near the Strip. We were in the suburbs. So, I've been to the Strip like fewer than 10 times in my life probably, and had never been there until visiting Las Vegas later, not even while I lived there. So, it was just living in the suburbs, a very deserty suburbs. It's not very green in Las Vegas. But I had a couple good friends, and we moved to Panaka because it was so hot in Vegas. So Panaka was about 160 miles north and at a bit higher elevation. My dad's a big dude, and he's forging Damascus, and it's just really hot. So we moved there. It was a very small town, small class sizes.
It looks really small. I pulled it up on the map.
Oh, yeah. It won't show up until you zoom way in.
Yeah.
No Walmart, no McDonald's. There was a restaurant a mile out of town. It closed down. Then after I moved out, they opened a little diner. It closed down. So, I mean, even getting to a small town restaurant, we had to drive 15 miles away for a lot of my childhood.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was just a big change. I'm introverted. I had a hard time fitting in because, in a small town, they've got their cliques already established. And if you're not good with other kids, convincing them that you're fun and cool, then it can be tough to break in.
Yeah.
So it was a tough move for me. But, I survived. But there are pros and cons to a small town. The benefit is that I could do football and track and choir and band, and I was the lead in a high school musical. So, in terms of the number of things you can do, there's just a lot, if you take advantage of it. 'Cause if I was in a big school, I wouldn't have made half of those teams. Definitely, I would not have made the football team at a big school. So it gave me some diversity and some experience. But just the quality of the programs is also less. So, I was really good at band. That was probably the thing I was best at. I made the all-state band in high school, which I worked really hard at, and I was really excited to make it in there. I was the only one
What did
from
you play?
The trumpet.
Oh, nice.
So, as a side tangent, my dad's identical twin, Darren, he is an excellent trumpet player. He got a master's degree in music.
Oh, wow.
Playing the trumpet.
Oh, very cool.
I played the trumpet horribly.
Play the alto sax.
Oh, you had all the ladies, didn't you?
Nice. Birch, were you all state trumpet, sir?
No, I played a trumpet that was given to me from my dad, who won it in a poker game.
Wow.
That's a hell of a story.
Fantastic. Yes, we need to have Mr. Monty Birch join us for an episode. I'm quite sure of it.
She's got a lot of stories.
Yes.
So, Larrin, when you moved up there, were you guys since it was more rural, were you on an acreage? Were you out running around in the wild, or,
We had a little bit of land. We didn't have acres and acres. We had enough to put a sizable shop in the backyard. I can't lie and call myself an outdoorsy kid, but there wasn't a lot to do in Panaka other than the outdoors. So, four-wheelers and dirt bikes were very popular. And my mom said that they were too dangerous. So.
Moms are like that. My mom said the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But we were we were a bit of a novelty in Panaka because, I mean, there was just very little industry. Most people worked for the state government or, the national government or the county government or, were school teachers. I mean, they were mostly tax-funded jobs in some way.
Did you get to use knives more? I guess where I'm kind of going is, trying to find out when you started using knives and if you had a first memory.
Yeah, I remember asking for knives probably by the time I was 7 or 8. My dad has a lot of siblings, so his youngest brothers were close to my age. And so I always looked up to them and thought they were super cool. And by the time they were 10 or 12, they had pocket knives, and I really wanted one. So I asked my mom, who again said that they were too dangerous, and I had to wait till I was 12. So I remember looking at like the A.G. Russell catalog and stuff, leading up to my 11th or 12th birthday, checking out all the knives and seeing what I wanted. And, I'd show my dad some ugly 90s tactical knife, and he's like, no. You don't want that.
So I got to ask, what was the first knife you got?
The first one I remember, it was a Microtech folder. I'm not sure the model, but it looked cool to me. It had like a black coating of some kind on it. It was in 154 cm. A lot of the junk knives I wanted out of the catalog were made out of 420 or something, and my dad would not allow that. So it had to be in 154 cm. This was even before S30V came out. So yeah, it was a Microtech folder. I'm not sure the model. I could find it. It was a small version of some knife. I usually prefer knives with around a 3-inch blade. Definitely once they get up to around 4 inches in a folder, it's just way too big for me.
Is it a UDT?
I don't think so. Are there
Mini
SOCOM? Yeah, Mini
Yeah.
SOCOM, I
Mini
think, is
SOCOM.
what it was.
Nice choice.
That's a high bar for a first knife.
No shit.
Well, my dad had a lot of experience with knives. He knew what good ones were. But
Yeah.
I mean, I was drawn to the more modern style of knives. My dad, when it comes to folders, is usually more about slip joints and traditional style folders. And he's made a handful, and I own one that he made also. I ruined one, and he made me another one. I lost 2 knives in a tragic accident in my late teens. We went to Blade Show, and I had knives in my bag, and my contact solution leaked out, and it just totally rusted that Microtech knife and a folder my dad had made me for Christmas, with Mokume bolsters and a Damascus blade and some kind of nice handle material. I don't even remember, stag or something, but it was pretty tragic, and it was just beyond saving. The blade was so pitted, it was just gone.
Saline solution, so yeah.
Yeah, salt water is really bad for knives.
Noted.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's probably like it is for lots of people. Everybody kind of, and maybe I would guess this is true for Michael too, right? Michael's father wrote tons of books, like how to do things kind of books. Super prolific author. He wrote for magazines and stuff as well, obviously, right, Michael?
Yeah.
So Michael's dad was an author, but I don't know. I mean, did you think of him as a big deal when you were growing up, or that he had a weird job?
No.
He's just your dad, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, it was you had the exposure by going to knife shows and realizing, oh, my dad's recognized as a guy who knows his stuff, right? And is doing cool things, but he's still just your dad, right? I mean,
from the time I was a young kid, my dad would tell all of us, he has 6 kids, of which I'm the oldest. So he would always tell us that he was world famous.
Okay.
So we always knew that we had a world famous dad. And we'd brag to all of our friends that our dad was world famous.
Okay.
Try to tell my kids that too. They still don't believe me.
No, you were indoctrinated early. We get it. Okay. That makes the whole situation much clearer.
They'd ask us who our dad was, and we'd say, he's Devin Thomas. And they'd say, who? Yeah.
All right, son, here's your mail.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Do you have any packages for world famous Devin Thomas on that truck, sir? What?
It fit in with the small town atmosphere too. Because it was so small, there's 3 towns that all go to the same high school, middle school. So there's Caliani, Panaka, and Pioche. And Caliani, 15 minutes away, had a restaurant called the Naughty Pine, and the sign on it says the world famous Naughty Pine, which I always found a little hard to believe that anyone would know about it.
Which way was that spelled?
Yeah, that changes everything.
Right.
Yeah, Naughty is K-N-O.
Oh, okay. So it was a regular restaurant.
Lost customer.
Yeah, there were no ladies of ill repute there, unfortunately.
Right.
That's what I tell everybody too,
Yeah, right. Sean denies it all.
and makes counter accusations.
That's right. Oh, too funny.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely knew who my dad was. And as I got older, I had a better understanding of exactly, how well known he was or how well respected he was in the knife business. I mean, even from the time that I went to those initial hammer-ins, people would tell me that my dad was a great Damascus maker, or, people definitely liked him. My dad has a good sense of humor. He's fun to be around. So he definitely had a lot of friends. He was well known. At knife shows, I'd quiz random people like, well, do you know who my dad is? He makes Damascus, and everybody always said yes. So I knew in the knife business that he was somewhat of a big deal. And when I look back on what he accomplished by my age, I'm always impressed by what he did. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so you kind of slid into it. You didn't have some kind of wow, Dad really is world famous, just like he said, kind of moment.
No, not really. I mean, it did kind of unfold a little bit, but like I said, I knew he was world famous by the time I could understand what that meant. So anything below that was only going down the ladder rather than up. So I never had some big epiphany, like, son, let me take you to the side here and let me tell you what a great man your dad is. That never really happened. Or if it did, it was just like, well, yeah, I already know that. So.
Could I pay you guys to do that to my kids at Blake?
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yes.
I'll be like, Tom, who?
Exactly. We accept cash, or Venmo is okay too. So Larrin, okay, so you're in Panaka, and it's like a 1-horse town apparently, kind of spot, right? Mm-hmm. You mentioned that it was kind of unique, and that was because your dad had a shop. He was actually doing stuff in Panaka, right? Which is kind of a trip. So coming out of Vegas to there, I know you said it was partially because of climate, right? To get to a cooler spot. Yeah. Was there like a, hey, our money will go a little farther the farther we go out, so we're going to go way out, that kind of thing as well? Or how the heck did they just land there?
No, and I don't really know. The story changes every time I talk to my parents.
I have that situation as well on occasion, but go ahead.
Because we had no family there or anything. And so, I mean, half the time they tell it like they just randomly picked a place. Sometimes they emphasize the spiritual nature, like they were praying for a place to find that would be a good fit. But it was a really random choice. And we had a brand new house in Las Vegas that my dad built. It was this really nice house. I mean, comparatively speaking. Then we moved to Panaka into this like 100-year-old house. It was a dump. So, and my dad tells me now, I don't remember, but like we pull into Panaka and park there, and I asked, are we poor now? Oh.
Ouch.
Yeah, that's rough. It's interesting. I think, I guess it wasn't the world famous Naughty Pine that took you there.
No, yeah, and I still don't know exactly. Maybe my parents don't even remember now. I mean, maybe it was just a fate-like decision. But
was there any big equipment purchases about that time?
I mean, my dad always buys equipment. It mostly ends up in the yard around the shop rather than in the shop, it seems.
Well, I just wondered if maybe when they changed houses, if he reinvested some of it into the business instead of, You know what I mean? A lot of times, like with my business, I've been strapped for capital or whatever, and sometimes that makes a big difference.
Yeah. Damascus
Yeah.
can't make itself, but you guys can put more clothes on if it's cold. I mean, that's just parenting.
Right.
We definitely never had a lot of money, and every time my dad bought a piece of equipment, it seems like it always put us further into debt. So, as world famous as my dad was, my mom says my dad can make anything except for money.
That's a very mom thing to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel that.
I don't
Yeah,
want Abby to know that saying.
We were never starving, but we never had much money. And it was always big ups and big downs. So, he'd go to the big knife show and he'd come back with just a huge wad of $100 bills in his pocket. But in between shows, we'd get to that lean period and, like my mom would send me to the store and I'd buy the wrong thing and, she'd start crying because that was our last $20 or something, So we were always fine, but there were some real ups and downs sometimes. And it seems like there were always bill collectors calling. So when anyone says that so-and-so knife maker or Damascus maker is making a killing, I kind of doubt it. So, I mean, my dad was as popular as anyone, and we were not rich. So.
Knife making is a tough gig. It really is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and especially with that whole feast or famine thing, like you're talking about, right? You got money 1 minute, and the next, a week later, sometimes a day later, you have a whole lot less.
We've talked about that a little bit, kind of the art versus business nature of makers too. It gets rough.
Yeah, and it's also something that just comes along with self-employment. I mean, I work for the man now, so I have only experienced it as a child. But, working for a company, you get a steady paycheck, whether you're putting in a lot of work or very little, as opposed to being self-employed where you're either getting big paydays or you're just getting nothing, it seems like sometimes.
Larrin, we'll edit out the part where you said not a lot of work, and we'll put in whether you do a lot of work or an extra lot of work.
Right.
Just in case your employer listens to this episode.
Well, I have pride in my work, so I put in a lot of work.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Good. Thanks for clarifying.
In case the man's listening.
As an employer, it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, some people just don't get it and don't do it.
Right.
They think they just got to punch the clock and not actually perform. They haven't connected that the more I do, the more I can make money for the company and the more I can get paid connection.
Hey, man, when you walk into a place every morning, like Crying Knives Galactic Headquarters,
right?
Right? There's a giant parking lot outside, the whole thing.
Think.
Sounds like something the man would say.
Oh, dang.
Well, and to me, like when I was going to University of Nevada, I had a job at a call center, which everybody hated that job. We would just call people for surveys and mostly people wouldn't answer. Some of them would just hang up on us or yell at us or whatever. And occasionally you'd get a survey. So, it wasn't that great of a job, but just sitting there, making the minimum number of calls that you're required to make was just not something I could do. Like I have to have some kind of goal or desire for the job that I'm doing. So for that job, for example, I was always trying to set the record for most calls made or most interviews done or something, not because I was really competitive, but just like, I'm going to be showing up here every day. I have to get something out of this, Right. So, there's got to be some goal here or I'll go insane.
All right. Well, since we're talking about work, did you help out in the shop any when you were younger?
Yeah, definitely. The biggest period was in between junior college and University of Nevada. So I went to Dixie State College in Utah for a year after high school, not really knowing what I was doing or what I should do. People that had their crap together were going to a real university and like had a program picked out. And I definitely did not have either of those things. So I went to Dixie State for a year. But my dad had some health problems. He's diabetic and he wasn't able to work for at least a year. And so after my year at Dixie State, I moved back home and didn't do online school or anything. It was less common then. And I just worked for my dad. So I didn't do any forging, but I sheared steel, I cleaned steel, I stacked steel. I ran a surface grinder a lot. I'm an expert in operating a Blanchard style surface grinder.
Hey, so are my kids.
I'm the best. You give me the thickness, I'll get it, plus or minus 1,000.
There you go.
You looking for a job or?
Larrin's looking for a side gig.
No, I'm just in a bragging mood right now.
World famous
got it
surface
on it.
grinder.
Right. He's the world famous super surface grinder. Yes, that's perfect.
And I made a couple knives during that time. So I learned how to make knives. I made a couple Santokus that I sold. I made those in AEBL, which is a super ubiquitous steel now, but almost no one had heard of it then. My dad used a lot of it in his Damascus, so he was always trying to convince people that AEBL was a steel worth using.
Yeah.
And so that was a losing battle for years, and now everybody uses it. So I learned to make knives, which was big, and I became even more interested in knives then during that year. I mean, I had almost nothing else to think about. There's no one my age around in Panaka. They're all off, at college or finding jobs in Vegas or trying to get married or whatever. I'm just trapped in Panaka, running a surface grinder at 5 a.m. every day. So,
Right.
so there was a lot of time to think, but yeah, that was one of my big peak times in terms of talking and about knives and working on knives and trying to sell them. And so I learned a lot during that year, but it was a tough year. I mean, my dad wasn't working. He's a grouchy guy at the best of times, and when he's not working, he's even grouchier, as you'd imagine.
Yeah.
And so, trying to live back at home after I'd been away for a year with my grouchy dad and working at this job that, I'm happy to help out, but I'm also not happy that I'm not in school, trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life. So
Yeah.
it was definitely a time where I felt kind of stuck. But at the same time, I was pursuing some of my interests when it came to knives. So a lot of time on the forums, a lot of talking to my dad about knives and steel and learning to make knives, and he's helping me. So, trying to grind that kitchen knife, I screw it up every few passes, and my dad's got to come in and do one clean pass to get it squared up again, So he was helping me the best he could. And yeah, but that was a tough year. And, I felt kind of like Luke Skywalker at the beginning of Star Wars: A New Hope, where he's telling what's his name, his uncle anyway, that he wants to leave and go to the academy, and his uncle's like, one more season.
Yeah.
I definitely experienced that. After the first semester was over, I'm like, I need to go. I need to go back to school, and he's like, no, I need you for another semester. And then I did another semester, and I'm like, all right, I'm going back to school next fall. And he's like, no, you're not. I need you more. And yeah, we had some fights about it, and I left to go to University of Nevada.
Crazy times, man.
Mm-hmm. So that was a tough period. And yeah, it was just a rough time. My dad not working, and he had some issues with his brother. His brother was working with him at the time also. And so it was just a tough time. I know my dad was having some depression at that time, not being able to work and having issues with his brother. And so, yeah, it was just rough on the whole family.
Yeah. Was it so when you went to go to UNLV? Did you? It doesn't sound like it was necessarily on the best of terms, but was everybody okay with it once you were off doing your thing, or was that kind of a sore spot for a while?
Yeah. Well, originally I was going to go to UNLV. But then during the next semester, I changed my mind and wanted to do material science because of my interest in steel. And so I went to UNR, University of Nevada, Reno.
Ah, okay.
So sorry that I was not clear in my story. But yeah, so yeah, initially, my dad's offering me knife making equipment and stuff if I'll stay because I wanted to make knives. And I'm like, no way, I'm out of here. So, he was mad for a week or two, and then we made up. We've done that a few times in my life.
I think we all have with fathers. It's a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, relationships with fathers can be complicated. And, I talk to my dad, several times every week. So we have a good relationship, but, we've had to fight for it sometimes.
Yeah. there's always bumpy times. I certainly went through it with my son. I certainly went through it with my dad, and we're not alone having that experience. So
100%.
yeah.
Yeah, so I don't want to make it sound like my dad was a bad person or anything, but I think sometimes it helps just to be real with people, about,
Sure.
we not just say, we have our rough spots, but, say what those rough spots were sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so you took off and went to school in material science. That the steel thing was kind of stuck in your head. It sounds like that's something you really wanted to go dive deeper into.
Yeah, like I said, I was really interested in those super steels and the super heat treatments, and I wanted to really get the true education. So when people are giving whatever BS line they're giving, then I know exactly what they're talking about. And is that true? Is that why he can bend that knife 90 degrees, or is it some other reason that he doesn't understand? I was pretty confident about going to engineering school. So material science is a branch of engineering. Because at Dixie State, I really built up my confidence. I was able to take a math class from a lawyer guy who would teach math on the side. And he was a really funny teacher. And just a lot of things clicked for me in that class. I went from never considering an engineering degree in a million years, like, calculus is for super geniuses or something. I was not taking those classes in high school. But that lawyer teaching math on the side at Dixie State, he gave me a lot of confidence. Like, I aced that class. I understood everything he was talking about. And so really over the course of that year being at home, it gave me a lot of time to think about what I wanted to do. And I just realized, hey, I can do anything. Like, I aced this math class. Like, I can go do whatever complex engineering school thing that's out there. I can do it. And so I realized, hey, I love steel. Nothing's stopping me from going and studying it. I can go get a materials degree because I can do math now, thanks to my lawyer teacher.
Right.
And so I went to University of Nevada and enrolled in the material science program, and I quickly realized that I was way too overconfident in my abilities to go to engineering school.
Reality check.
Yeah, engineering school is really hard, and
yes,
the kids that go there, they were all smart suburban kids that did great in math and science. And in school, they usually had big AP programs that were all excellent. A lot of the kids I talked to, like, what high school did you go to? And they'd all give the same one, with like some amazing chemistry teacher that they all loved,
Yeah.
And I remember going to physics class. It was like a physics 201 or something. It was my first physics class. And the professor just said, like, oh, we're going to skip the first 4 chapters because you already covered that in AP physics in high school. And I was like, I am in so much trouble right now. And my lawyer teacher in math, he was very easy to understand. But, I'd go to calculus class, and the teacher's teaching like 250 students. And those kids are all from nice high schools, so they know how to study apart from the teacher. The teacher doesn't have to make sense. They'll all go and like read the textbook and figure it out. And those were not skills that I had developed yet. So I really had to push myself in that first semester. I got to get this nailed down or I'm going to wash out. And there were only 3 or 4 of us that were in material science that first semester. It was not a big program. And 2 of the other ones switched to business school after just a couple semesters. So it was not easy. I was really thrown in the deep end. I could not have done it straight from high school. Without that year at junior college and then the year at home, I would not have been mature enough or confident enough in my abilities to be able to do that. So for that, I'm grateful. Just that it took me a little bit longer to really figure out what I wanted to do and to give me some maturity and perseverance,
No, and a great example of a great teacher or great mentor setting somebody on a path, right? Your math teacher that you really enjoyed, that kind of got you in the mindset, oh, I can do this, right? Everybody has those along the way, or lots of people do. And interesting example of that. I went to engineering school as well, and I was a suburban kid who did great in math and science, and it still kicked my ass. Engineering programs are no joke.
Yeah, and I definitely had some imposter syndrome. I definitely still have it. Imposter syndrome being like you feel like you're not as smart as the other people, or like you don't belong here.
Yep.
You show up to a class or a job or something, and everyone starts spouting out complicated equations or something, and you're like, I'm not as smart as that guy. You get a C on the exam, and you're like, oh man, we must have all done bad on this exam. And you look at the guy on your left, and he's got a big A+ written on his, and you're like, oh no. And so I think a lot of people struggled. I don't think it was easy for most of us. I think mostly you're just embarrassed to talk about it with people. Like when you get that D+ on the exam that you studied for a week for, and you just fold it up and put it in your backpack and count the minutes until you can get out of there.
Yeah, hard experiences, but maybe as you found out, right? Not stuff you couldn't overcome, but you really had to. At least I had to really put my nose to the grindstone to make it work.
Yeah, I do wonder sometimes how much luck was involved, because I know going into some of those final exams, I'd be, tallying up some of my scores like, all right, you got to get a B+ on this or you're going to be retaking it.
Yeah.
And, maybe if I had put down something slightly different on a couple of those exams, if I failed and had to retake something, I don't know how I would have handled it emotionally.
Yeah.
So, I wonder sometimes, like, I don't know, the angels looking down on me, for those key moments, how would I have handled it? And then, again, when I was in grad school at Colorado School of Mines, I had the really big PhD qualifying exam that I studied for months. And just if I had failed that and had to retake it, I don't know if I could have. I had just put everything I had into that first attempt.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you have to think about those moments sometimes, like, you can't look down too much on someone else that didn't quite make it. I mean, it could have been me sometimes, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I had to retake a class in undergrad, and it was a good learning experience, right? Like, wow, I can't kind of fake my way through this thing, or, you know what I mean? Find a way to make it work. It was a good life lesson. It was a very hard one, an expensive one, right? Because you pay for stuff twice and go through the pain twice, and you feel bad about it for a while, but gotta suck it up and go back and fix it. And I don't know, there's something to be learned from that kind of experience for sure, at least for me.
Yeah, I remember being in Calculus 3 and talking to this guy who said he was taking it for the third time. Now, if you fail it 3 times, you're just done. Like you can't take it again.
Yeah.
And I was asking him, what he got for number 6 on the homework or something, and he said, "Oh, I don't do the homework. It's only worth 10%." Like, what a waste of time. I'm like, you're taking it for the third time.
Yeah, maybe that's why. Yep. It all makes sense now. Yeah, very interesting. All right, so material science. So did you finish that at that same school and get your undergrad in material science?
Yep. I got my bachelor's degree in material science and engineering. It's got an "and" in the name, but it's one degree.
Yeah.
I got married while I was working on my undergrad to Jessica. She was working on a degree in music. She was from not my hometown, but from Caliente, 15 miles away. So we knew each other from high school, started dating in Reno, and got married. So, I mean, we got married pretty young. Most people my age are not getting married in their early 20s. They're mostly waiting until they have a career and things. So I don't know why we were in such a hurry, really, but it worked out for us. So, and yeah, we got pregnant with our first child while we were in Reno, but he wasn't born until we had moved to Golden, Colorado for grad school.
Wow. I have a number of friends who had kids while they were in college, and I don't know. I was definitely not ready for that when I was in college.
Seems like that'd be really tough.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a really smart decision. I mean, I was taking classes at 7:30, 9 in the morning, and I've got a newborn baby who's waking up every 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm going to class and nodding off, and the professor's, snapping his fingers in my face and asking why I'm not awake.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, it'd be rough. I had a hard enough time just taking care of myself in college.
What drove you to go to grad school? So was that kind of, I just want to keep going, I enjoy school, I want to learn more? Is that what took you in that direction?
Yeah, from the story I've told so far, it sounds a little odd since I'm talking about imposter syndrome and struggling sometimes in my undergrad. But, I was getting near the end of my bachelor's degree, and I'm thinking about what I want to do. The companies around Reno were mostly mining, like gold companies and things, and I was not interested in any of that. We got extra credit for interviewing with a company, and I went in and bombed an interview with a gold mining company. I just was not interested in doing that. And I was like, well, I'm really interested in steel and making new steels. I thought S30V was super cool being made for knives, and I wanted to do that. And so, I asked around with my professors, how do you go and develop new steels? How do I do that? And they said, if you want to be in development, like R&D, you really need a higher level degree, preferably a PhD. And so I was like, a PhD? I've been going to school for what feels like a decade. How can I go to more school? But I looked at my grades, and they weren't as bad as I thought. I think I had a 3.6 or a 3.7. Because, I got a couple of C's. I was like, so my GPA can't be that high, but I got a bunch of A's in easier classes, easier for me anyway. And so it all balanced out where my GPA was good enough to go to grad school, most likely. So I was like, well, what I really want is to develop new steels. So, let's not mess around. Let's go do what I really want to do in life. So, I talked to my wife, and she was on board. She wanted me to pursue my dreams. So I started studying for the GRE, whatever that stands for. It's like the SAT or ACT, but for grad school.
Yeah.
And I studied that a bunch. I really wanted to get a good score. I emailed Dr. Verhoeven, the metallurgist who wrote the book and worked with Alpendre. And he told me that the best school to go to was Colorado School of Mines. He said that was the best metallurgy school. So yeah. I sent an email to Colorado School of Mines, and I said, hey, I'm really interested in steel. I grew up with my dad, and I think knives are really cool. I want to work with knife steel someday. And they were really excited. There's always kids that are interested in metallurgy, some more than others. But, I was coming in like, hey, I love this. This is exactly what I want to do. You guys do steel there? Like, that is what I want. For other kids, they're like, I'll be a metallurgist someday. And what material am I going to work on? I don't know. But this steel research center is going to pay me money. So I'll go do that for 4 to 6 years,
Yeah.
But I was emailing them and calling them on the phone like, hey, I really want to go to your program because you've got the best program for metallurgy and for steel. And so they were excited. And so I think even with worse scores and GPA, they still would have taken me. Just, passion is lacking sometimes, especially in students, but just in life in general. I mean, there's a lot of people clocking in and clocking out in jobs like we were talking about earlier. Yep. And I can't do that. I really need something that is gonna get me excited every day. And so I just went for it. I'm from Panaka, and I had to learn how to do math from a lawyer in southern Utah, but it's not too late. Then I went to Colorado School of Mines with a pregnant wife, and
wow,
a lot of optimism.
Colorado School of Mines is a fantastic school. I think a lot of people that aren't familiar with engineering stuff, a lot of people have not heard of that school. If they're not technology people, mechanical technology people, but great school, great rep. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, I had never heard of it either. Actually, I think I heard about it for the first time at the Eugene show, that some guy who had just come out of college was working for Kershaw or something, and he said he went to Colorado School of Mines. And I'm like, mines? Like MIDS? Like mines? And he's like, no, like mine, like mining. And I'm like, oh, like School of Mines, like your brain just sounds really hoity-toity. I'm like, well, how smart do you guys think you are?
Right. Yeah. You were there digging holes and stuff. Easy.
Yeah, but instead it's primarily an engineering school. There's some other programs also, but it's a relatively well-known engineering school. And their metallurgy program, though, is second to none. It's as good as any in the country, and it's competitive worldwide. They're really well known for their excellent metallurgy program. And so I was excited to go there. Some of the best steel professors, and there was a steel research center. So they got sponsors from steel companies and automotive companies and things, and professors that were well known for making discoveries and contributions in steel specifically. So I couldn't wait. I was going to the steel mecca, basically.
Yeah, perfect spot.
Yeah, so I went to the best of the best when it comes to steel. And it was everything I hoped it was going to be. All students working on steel research. Every 6 months, we did presentations to our industrial sponsors, so the steel companies and things. So it was really nerve-wracking. We'd do all these experiments and write them up in a paper and then make a PowerPoint and present them. And there's just a room full of 120 steel metallurgy experts who are ready to tell you every stupid thing you just said in a presentation. Some of them are nicer than others. Right. When you said that the dislocation density was higher, you meant lower, right? You're like, by the tone of your voice, I think the answer is yes, that I meant lower.
Unless you wanted me to say no, in which case it probably was no.
Yeah. And so it could be nerve-wracking sometimes. Some schools, you'll see a thesis come out from someone, out of a university that doesn't do much steel research. And they might be able to skate by, with a professor advisor who doesn't know that much steel. So they might make a couple mistakes in there. Because, nobody can know everything. They might be an excellent metallurgist, but just not know that much about steel specifically.
Yeah.
That was not going to happen at the school I was at. So... they really knew their stuff. There were some really good professors there, and it was just a really good experience. And that's really where I learned, how to set up an experiment, how to do experiments, how to interpret experiments, how to write up an experiment. And so leading into like my website, Knife Steel Nerds, or my book where I publish different little experiments that we do. That was all second nature to me by the time I was done with my PhD, because I'd done it already.
Yeah, very cool. So, did you do both your master's and your PhD at Colorado?
Yeah, I skipped my master's and I got a PhD instead. I don't know what it's like at every school, but the people who would get master's degrees at Colorado School of Mines would spend 3 years on their master's and then like another 3 or 4 years to get a PhD.
Yeah.
And they allowed you to skip the master's. I'm like, why am I going to spend all that extra time? I'm just going to skip it and get the PhD. And it took me about 4.5 years. And, there were people that were still working on their PhD that were there when I got there. So, the people that got the master's in between, it just took an extra couple years. And it seemed like all the master's degrees people were doing were almost as much work as the PhD thesis anyway. Just because the standards were so high. So, it was basically just doing 2 PhD degrees to get a master's. And so I just went straight to the PhD. But
interesting. Yeah, I just assumed. Oh.
It was a bit nerve-wracking, though, because there's a PhD qualifying exam that you have to pass to get the PhD. If you fail it twice, then you can only get a master's degree.
Okay.
And I just studied for that for months. I mean, I did no classes. I did almost no experiments. I just went to the library every morning and studied for that exam. And it had an 8-hour written portion, then a 4-hour written portion, and then a 2-hour oral exam in front of professors.
Wow.
And I've never had so much anxiety about any one event in my entire life. Even the defense of my thesis was nothing to the level of that qualifying exam. I was just so nervous for that thing.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Huh. So, while you're at school, it was really focused on research stuff, basically, in that kind of environment of projects that are related to the industries that are, the steel companies that are interested in what you're doing. steel consumers that are interested in what you're doing?
Yeah, I was doing a project on what are called dual phase steels. They're a type of sheet steel used in cars. And so I would do experiments. The main company that was interested in my research was called Tube Investments of India, which is just a company that makes like tubes for bicycles and stuff. And they would heat them. They would heat the steel really rapidly, like with induction heating. And so they were interested in how does the steel behave differently when you're heating it up really fast. And so my experiments were all about rapid heating of steel versus slow heating of steel and looking at the microstructure changes and how they'd be different. And so you don't take as many classes as you do as a full-time student. You take basically like half-time classes, half-time research. I also did some teaching assistant stuff. Because we would get a stipend, and that stipend was paid for in part by us being teaching assistants.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's basically like having a full-time job. You get up every morning and you go to school all day, either in classes or doing research, or you're in your office, either for office hours for teaching assistant or writing up experiments or analyzing your data or that kind of stuff. So yeah, I'd get up every morning and kiss my wife goodbye and kiss the baby and be on my way. And yeah, a lot of my focus was on that experimental research apart from when I worked on the PhD qualifying exam. So we used lots of technical equipment, electron microscopes. We had this big machine called a Gleeble where we would take really small pieces of steel and put them in a pretty large machine. And then you could do specific like thermomechanical processing and measure changes in the steel in the machine. So, you could do really fast heating rates, or you could put compression on the steel at certain temperatures, or a lot of what I was doing is just putting a small piece of steel in, heating it up really fast, cooling it down really fast so that I could then cut it up and look at it under the microscope. There's also a technique called dilatometry, where you measure either with a laser or just like a spring-loaded like clip type thing, measures the size change in the steel. And like when it transforms to austenite as you're heating up. So, you're heating up the steel and it transforms to austenite, which is non-magnetic. So, people use magnets a lot to see when it transforms before they quench.
Yeah.
And when it transforms to austenite is more dense than the regular low temperature phase of steel called ferrite. So because it's more dense, the steel will shrink. So, it's like a linear line heating up. The steel gets bigger as it heats up and gets smaller as you cool down. But you can see a deviation in your linear growth right where it transforms. And so you can measure your transformation temperatures and things with that technique called dilatometry. So I was learning some of these advanced techniques and experimental work. Some universities are more theoretical or computational based, so they learn a lot of modeling and things. But our school was very focused on experimental work, so it was very hands-on.
Yeah. So as you were going through all that stuff, you still had your eye on the prize on knife steels, I assume, or were you kind of looking in other directions, like, oh, I could do other stuff with this kind of capability?
Yeah, definitely when I first showed up at school, I mean, at University of Nevada, I'm already pestering the professors, like trying to ask them about vanadium additions to steel. And they're like, that's not really what we're going to cover in this class. They're talking about like the different atomic structures in the materials. And I'm like, great, like when are we going to get to rapid heat treatment of steel for toughness improvements, and right. we never did get there. But when I went to Colorado School of Mines, I'm saying like, maybe I could do some kind of project with tool steel or stainless steel. And they're like, well, here's the list of projects that came from our sponsors. And I'm sure we can find one here that's going to be a good fit for you, and I think at the time I was telling my professor about like triple quenching or something, which is a hot topic in knives. And I was like, maybe I could do something on triple quenching and look at the grain size differences or toughness differences. And so he was like, well, it sounds like you're really into heat treating. So we have this heat treating project. And that's how I ended up with the dual phase steel rapid heating project. Okay. It was good for me to broaden my horizons a little bit because I now work in automotive sheet steel development. And it's a much more active area than tool steel or martensitic stainless steel. So when it comes to doing development on new steels, it's a good place to be. And so, I learned what was interesting and cool about automotive steels. And that was good for me. There are some similarities. There are a lot of differences. Sometimes it's almost like I learned a different material type, like I learned about aluminum or titanium or something, just because of how different they are. But of course, there's crossover in metallurgy. So that was good. I developed an interest in automotive steel, and I was able to get a job that way.
Well, that's one of the cool parts about a university experience that includes heavy involvement from major players in industry, is that it positions you really, really well, right? Like your experiences stand in front of people and presenting information to people in industry is different than presenting information to people in academia, right? At least my experience was.
Yeah.
And you get a lot of real world perspective out of that, and you're working on projects that in the end become valuable, right? Like when you put your resume together, oh, well, I worked on these development projects, and especially in an industry that has very specific interests, it can be hugely helpful for placement afterward.
Yeah, I can definitely put together a mean presentation now. I got pretty good at it, doing it every 6 months.
Yeah.
And even though I am pretty introverted, I like teaching in front of people. I like presenting. I think that's fun. I like adding in a joke here or there to keep people paying attention. So I learned to like that kind of stuff, and maybe some of that fed into Knife Steel Nerds, where I like teaching. I don't know exactly what it is. I talk to some people that are into steel or metallurgy, or people selling steel, and they just complain all the time about the so-called idiots they have to deal with all the time. Trying to teach them how to work steel right or something. But I've always felt a drive like to teach things, to try to help people understand them. Because it's easy to think things are just way too complicated, or you could never understand them. And engineers or scientists are used to talking to each other. They use all of their technical jargon and all of their complicated topics, and they're way past the initial stages. And so, some of them don't know how to talk to the general public, and maybe I don't either, if you read some of the comments on my website. But I like to teach, and I like to make things simple as they can be, without dumbing them down. Like, can I get anyone to understand all of this steel metallurgy and heat treating stuff? I don't think there's like an IQ barrier here. Anyone can understand enough to learn some things and to know how to pick a steel for a knife and how to heat treat a knife.
So you finished your PhD. Did you have something lined up before you finished up, or was that something that came after, or what was your timeline into putting air quotes around real world?
Yeah, I started interviewing for jobs when I was projected to finish my PhD, like in a few months. And so I started asking, like when we had our every 6 months meeting, I started talking to some of our industrial sponsors, the metallurgists I was closer to, and like, hey, are you going to have any jobs ready in the next few months? And some of them said yes, some said no. I hit a pretty decent spot when I was graduating, because there were several companies that were all trying to hire development metallurgists, and I really wanted a development job. There's a lot of jobs for quality engineers, where it's just finding and fixing problems, basically. Right. And that's a perfectly good way to be an engineer. But what I really wanted was research and development. I wanted to push boundaries and try different alloying elements and heat treat in different ways, and really explore the new stuff instead of just fixing what someone else broke.
Yes.
So, there's different jobs for different personalities, and what I wanted was research and development. And so there were several jobs open. I talked to some metallurgists. I'd made a good, I had a decent reputation from the research that I had done. I don't think I was the top student, but I was animated and excited, which I think came across. And so, I went and interviewed at US Steel Research. It was the main interview that I did. I think I interviewed at one other company, and they were dragging their feet to interview someone else. And so they lost out on me because they moved too slow. So I went to Pittsburgh. I think I owned one suit, and it had a hole in the crotch. So, I had to make sure that I was always positioned correctly when I was doing those interviews.
Strategically.
Yeah, exactly. So, Pittsburgh, I thought was cool. I mean, it was far away from anywhere I'd ever lived. I'd never been to Pittsburgh until I showed up at the airport for the interview. And I just talked to them about how I love steel and how I had done all my research and I was ready to contribute and I really wanted to develop new stuff. And they were all excited about me and I got that job. So definitely Colorado School of Mines was a big help in getting those connections. I mean, there were already people who knew who I was. I already had connections with big companies who were doing the kind of stuff that I wanted to do. So yeah, I couldn't have gone anywhere better than Colorado School of Mines. And so just like I had a new baby going right into grad school, we also had our second child right after I finished writing my thesis, but before I defended it, we had our baby girl. And so we had a pretty new baby when we moved to Pittsburgh. So right when I was starting a new job and, well, defending my thesis and then starting a new job, we had a baby. So I don't know if I lined up those babies very well, but I made it through.
No, that's crazy. We had Grace Horn on with us, lady out of the UK who makes scissors and knives, but really scissors is her thing these days. And yeah, how many kids did she have when she was in college? Do you have both of her kids when she was still in school? I'm pretty sure. Do you remember?
I think so.
That baffles me because, like I said, I was not ready for that. I was way too dumb. Well, Pittsburgh, yeah, like you said, cool town. Primanti Brothers.
Yeah, that's big around here.
Yes. All right. So, and you're still there.
Yep. Still in Pittsburgh. It's been a little over 5 years now. My job's been going well. I like developing new steel. But, we can transition into knife steel nerds a little bit. I liked my job. It's not that I needed something, like I was, missing something at work or anything. But while I was at grad school, I had taken a little bit of a break from knife steel related things. I was a little disappointed I wasn't going to be doing triple quenching for my PhD thesis. And so I think I kind of just shifted focus. I'm married, I got a new baby, I'm working on automotive sheet steel, and I just kind of faded away a little bit from knife related things. I was not going on the forums every day like I had in the past. But at U.S. Steel Research, I started to get a little more into it, starting to get back on the forums, what's going on, what are the new knives that are coming out, what are the trends, what steels are people interested in, that kind of stuff. And I had hoped that having my PhD in metallurgy now, I'd have a little more authority on the forums, which I soon found out I did not.
Yes.
So I started getting back into it. I don't know if I ever really left, but there were definitely people, around 2013, 2014 that wouldn't have known who I was around the forums anymore just because I wasn't really going to them frequently. So, yeah, I started going on the forums. I'd answer people's questions about steel and metallurgy. And I wanted to do some bigger write-ups because, people would have the same questions all the time or the same misunderstandings all the time. Like, people keep saying the same thing about heat treating that is just not right, so.
What are some of those? I'm intrigued by some of the biggest misconceptions.
Common ones are about cryo. Cryo is really mysterious. There's a whole industry built around it, which is kind of designed to mislead you about what cryo is. A lot of forging guys will tell you that cryo does nothing on low alloy or carbon steels. And lots of stock removal guys will tell you that cryo has to be done on stainless steels. And really, neither is true. And it's mostly just a misunderstanding of what cryo does and how it works. And so that was one of my early posts that I made on Blade forums. So I had a whole write-up on what happens during cryo. Like, what is it doing? What are things that it doesn't do that people say that it does? How do different steels react? How does the way that you austenitize and quench affect how it then behaves in cryo? All those kinds of things. And so I worked on that, for a few days and got it got it nice and tight and hopefully easy to understand, and I published it. And, a couple people said, "Oh, this is great. Thanks, Larrin. Attaboy." And then, then it faded away into the second or third page. And then someone started a new thread about cryo asking the same questions. And I was like, are you serious? Like I wrote this beautiful article about cryo for you people. And then you just immediately forgot about it.
You people. That's how you know Larrin was pissed. You people.
You people.
I think you mistook a forum for an actual good debate, which isn't going to happen.
Yeah, well, and
Yeah,
forums are very...
no one knows how to use a search function.
Yeah, nobody searches.
No.
Forums are very circular. It's like every day is a new day. People show up, they leave after a couple years when they're not interested anymore. And the same topics happen over and over and over again. And so the people that really stick around on forums are the people that want to have the same discussions over and over and over again.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. I never thought of it that way, but it's 100% correct.
I had to leave a lot of the shop talking forum parts because every day was, which grinder should I get?
Yeah.
And it's like, this was asked yesterday, the day before. It's repetitive, Groundhog Day-ish.
Yeah, and so some people can handle it. Some people are like, I'm here to help educate people, and I'll answer that same question every day or once a week, and they can do that. I'm not as good at doing that as they are. So I thought, well, if I just make a website, like I can make another cryo article or some other articles, and then they'll always be there. And then if I want to answer someone on a forum that asks about cryo again, I just post a link to my article, and it won't disappear. Sometimes you're uploading photos for something on the forums to Photo Bucket or whatever the sites are these days, and then those sites just kill your links, and then none of it makes sense anymore. So the website, as long as I'm paying for the hosting, it'll always work. So the website just seemed like a place where I could have something a little more permanent, and people could hopefully find my website and then go back and read all those articles, and it kind of evolved from there.
Nice. When did you start that, Larrin? The Knife Steel Nerds website?
I think it was at the beginning of 2018, something like that. And so my first article, I was just testing the waters. I wrote about a modification of CPM 3V that they patented that used mostly niobium instead of vanadium. I just wanted to write something simple and easy to write, for me anyway. And I published that. I guess I can look up when that article was posted, and then I'll know exactly when I started. Okay, February 27th, 2018.
Yeah, okay.
And I think I kind of publicly announced the website a few weeks after that. Like I wrote a few articles first. I think I wrote my whole series on austenitizing before I published the site. And so then I started posting around the forums and Facebook and stuff like, hey, come to my new website. You can read all about austenitizing. It's the hot topic.
It's an interesting thing. You were telling that story about writing up the cryo article, and it's, the knife world, obviously, like, sometimes I think it's less screwed up, and sometimes I think it's just as screwed up as like the gun world or wherever. There are many parts of those types of things that are deeply rooted in some combination of tribal knowledge and complete BS. You know what I mean? Like there's legends about stuff, and it's just the way it is because it's the way it is. You know what I mean? Like there isn't science related explanations or whatever. And, kind of like you alluded to in some of your things you saw as a young man, right? About, oh, this is my special steel, or this is my special heat treat, or whatever. Some of it's mysterious by design, right? Because everyone wants to have a special product. And so, it seems like some of these articles have a great opportunity to grow you a strong hater base. Is that?
Yeah, sometimes that happens. I mean, I get the whole range. So like you said, people that don't know anything and send me questions that I'm like, well, didn't you try to read something first before you contacted me?
Yes.
and that's fine.
Sorry about that.
I can answer them. Like I'll survive, but it feels weird because sometimes I get trolls that are just telling me that I'm an idiot, and
Yes.
like how could I possibly think that way? So it's like on one end where these people think they're way smarter than me and that I don't know anything that I'm talking about, and then I get an email, that's like, so do I have to wrap it in foil before I put it in the forge to heat treat it?
Right.
And it's like, you get the whole range. So you go from feeling like, oh, I'm way above this person emailing me and asking questions. He doesn't know anything. And then I get comments on my website. I'm like, do I know what I'm talking about? Maybe I don't. And but we're in a little bit of an interesting time now with the internet, because like you said, there's the gun world, but there's lots of little pockets now that exist because of the internet that really couldn't exist before.
Yes.
And we get these groups of nerds, like knife steel nerds is what I do, or knife nerds, or watch nerds, or gun nerds, or people into video games or whatever. There's just a million areas where before, there might be one guy in your town or one guy in your county or one guy in your state that is as into this topic as you are. And you may never even find that person, or like you might get together with him once every few years. So before, these nerds like felt very isolated. But now you can find your people, and
Yes.
get really into the weeds on something that most people aren't going to care about. So it's good and bad. It also allows people with very dangerous ideas or hateful ideas or to also find each other.
Yes.
And build each other up. So it's an interesting time. So obviously I try to make a positive impact, and I think being a nerd about knife steel is a good thing. Everybody who wants to should be able to go and read everything they want to read about it, and that's what I'm offering to them.
It's good to have like actual scientific, sort of data, as opposed to somebody. And I think that's why so many people would believe this, like Mark called it, kind of tribal knowledge. And I think that's sort of what some of the early forum stuff was. They'd be like, well, it works because look at so-and-so's doing it, and he obviously knows what he's doing. Nothing really backing it up, just the fact that what he's doing worked, so it must be right.
Yeah, well, you can do a lot of things wrong, and the end knife still functions, So,
Absolutely.
So a lot of myths can be built up just in that gray area of you didn't screw it up badly enough where it will still cut things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But I think sometimes a little bit too much science, people get like, well, you're kind of digging in their pocket, like, of things they were using to sell, these marketing techniques like we talked about.
Yeah, and I have made people mad here or there, talking about their sacred cows. I've never specifically attacked anybody. I've never said, oh, Tom Crine, his heat treatment is terrible. Never buy knives from him.
If I had a nickel for every time I said that.
Dang it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do better.
He's got a good heart. Bless his heart, I think they say down south.
Right.
I've never attacked any big names. I've never said, oh, Ed Fowler's 52-100, it's no good, and let me tell you why, or Bob Dozier's D2, it's overrated. I've never done anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying those are beliefs of mine. I'm just bringing up examples of, if you want to pick a big target and make a bunch of enemies, you can try to do it. I've never done that. But
your article that was D2 is the Trailer Homo Steals. I thought that was an excellent article. I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Oh, Tom is a D2
What
devotee just to set the stage for Larrin, so he knows what he's being sucked into.
I was going to ask him his thoughts about that later. Oh. Now it's all ruined.
He loves his D2.
I have a couple articles about D2.
I've read them.
Surprise. I'm not saying be careful about D2 in our conversation, Larrin.
I know exactly what I'm getting into. That's why I brought it up.
Oh, good.
I've been around for a while.
All right. We're ready for whatever D2 stones you want to throw, because we're bracing ourselves for Tom's reaction. It'll be wonderful.
I think D2's fine.
There you go. All right. Thanks for being with us. We'll talk to you later.
If you're into, no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I mean, I like
It's like
CPM D2 better, but D2
Really?
D2 works great.
See, I don't. And the reason is I like D2 because of that toothy edge. And when you go to, I don't get me wrong. I think CPM D2 is very similar to XHP, and I like XHP a lot. But they're different. So yeah.
Yeah, almost never on my site do I say don't use this steel.
Right.
I mean, I usually talk about the pros and cons of each one. You know, like you might want to use this steel for this or this or this reason. You wouldn't want to use it for this or this. It has a reputation as being this, but it's not. It has a reputation for being this, and it is. You know, I usually cover those kinds of things and talk about the history of different things. You know, I definitely mentioned Bob Dozier as helping to popularize D2, you know, stuff like that. So I like the history. I like to talk about what steels actually are.
That's where I cut my teeth. So
yeah, I don't do any gotcha articles or clickbait articles. I think the closest thing I ever did was I said that ZDP 189 is overrated. But even that is a pretty niche topic. Not everybody even knows about ZDP 189.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the triple quenching a couple times, probably just as something as an example, but I mean, that was a pretty hot topic there for a bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's when I go a little bit back and forth. I mean, I mentioned going to my PhD, I really wanted to do a project related to it. And there is science to back it up. So a metallurgist with the last name Grange, he was a U.S. steel metallurgist back in the 60s. And he published a couple papers where he took lead baths and he would do rapid heat treating in lead baths. So he'd take 52-100, for example, and he'd put it in the lead bath for a pretty short amount of time and then quench out and see, you know, with rapid heat treating, how fine could he get the grain size. And then he would do that multiple times and see if he could further refine the grain size. And Verhoeven wrote about multiple quenching a little bit in his book as well. So there's nothing inherently wrong theoretically with triple quenching. Now, I've done quite a few experiments for Knife Steel Nerds and my book, and so I've done triple quenching for that. My dad did some on some Crewforge V. I did some experiments on O1. We also did what's called a pre-quench on AEBL and A2, which is somewhat similar to a triple quench, but your initial hardening temperature is lower than your final. And I didn't measure the grain size on them, but I measured the toughness, and the toughness was just never better. So, I mean, it's hard to recommend something when I can't measure it in a way that shows that an improvement has been made. You know, that's kind of an engineering thing you have to learn. You know, like you can't do a bunch of extra processes because you think it might be better. You know, you have to measure it and see that you actually improved it. And I haven't managed to do that with multiple quenching.
Well, this might be a good... Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So in general, I don't recommend doing it because it can add extra complications potentially. You know, it changes how your heat treatment works and you have to adapt to that at the very least. But I also haven't measured an improvement. So.
Okay. Well, this might be a good time to kind of talk about some of the words used and have you kind of explain what they actually mean. Like you mentioned toughness. What does that actually mean with steel?
Yeah, toughness is a more complicated subject than you might think, but I'll try to keep it simple. So in general, toughness is just how well does a piece of steel or a material resist breaking. So that's the most general definition. It's complicated as a metallurgist because we have multiple types of tests for toughness. Like there's a test called fracture toughness where you induce a crack in the steel first, and then you see the force required to pull it apart. And so you take out the element of initiating a crack and only look at crack growth. The main test that we do with tool steels, and the one that I do in all of my experiments, is called impact toughness. And even impact toughness has multiple different types. So Crucible has a test they call, which is a C-notch. So you have a rectangular specimen and you grind out a little scoop out of it. so that it's got a place where it's going to break when you impact it. And you use a machine, it's called an impact tester. It's got a big hammer on a pendulum. And you put a piece of steel at the bottom and you raise the arm of the pendulum and you drop it so that the hammer passes through the steel. And so the hammer weighs so much that it just goes straight through the steel and breaks it in half. And if it were to go through air, like there's no piece of steel at the bottom, that hammer would reach the same height at the other side, or approximately if you subtract out the friction in the system and the wind resistance. So if it got all the way back up to the other side, it would have 0 toughness because, the hammer just passed straight through. Now it's got a piece of steel it has to pass through, then some amount of energy is lost and the hammer doesn't reach as high. And then we have a dial that tells you how much energy the steel absorbed as the hammer passed through it. And so if you absorb energy on your way to breaking, the more energy you absorb, the higher your toughness. So again, I'll remind you the simple definition. How difficult is it to break a material?
Okay. Well, I mean, you see it thrown around a lot for describing a steel. And sometimes I don't know if people are thinking elasticity, or are they thinking, and is that basically what they mean, is the impact ability of the steel when they're throwing that word around to use as a knife steel?
Yeah, another way of looking at it is just the way that the material failed. So if a knife chipped or broke, you're dealing with toughness in some way.
Okay.
So anytime you've broken something, you've created a crack and grown that crack, we're talking about toughness. And so that can manifest in different ways. You can bend a knife till it breaks. You can slam your knife into a cinder block and it breaks. You can be prying a knife out of something and chip it either on a micro level or a macro level. Those are all toughness related things. And we can measure toughness in a lot of ways. But generally, if it's tougher, it's more resistant to chipping or breaking when we're talking about a knife.
Okay.
But there are a lot of confusing areas because you can see frequently like, oh, I had 15V steel, which is not a tough steel, at 66 Rockwell, and I chopped through this nail with it. You said this steel wasn't tough. But that's why my book is called Knife Engineering. Because it's not just the steel or even just the heat treatment that gives the knife the performance that it does. If anything, I think we've kind of painted ourselves into a corner by talking about heat treatment too much. People always talk about heat treatment being the most important thing. Heat treatment is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the design, especially of the edge geometry. If you put a beefy edge on a knife, you can have a very brittle piece of steel, or relatively brittle piece of steel, and it can do surprising, amazing things. So we can't divorce the knife away from its edge geometry. So we have our steel choice, our edge geometry, and our heat treatment, and they all matter.
Yeah.
So
Three-legged stool.
right. And so when we have a total knife, we have to look at all those components. So if we talk about a knife being tough, that's different than a steel being tough. For me as a metallurgist, I want to just measure the properties of the steel itself. You give me a buck knife in 420 HC and then a Tom Crine knife in D2 and say, tell me which one's better, D2 or 420 HC. I'd say I don't really have a good way of doing that with these two things you've given me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think that kind of goes back to like the forum stuff, because we would get that a lot. Like just one thing, what is the best steel? And like you said, it's more than just the steel. It's like you said, the edge, all the stuff that goes together. So another one that I see thrown around quite a bit, wear resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wear resistance is resistance to wear. Next one.
Drops mic, walks off.
Yep.
But I never thought of it like that.
Wear resistance is another one that's tough to measure. It's known for having a lot of scatter in the data when you're trying to measure it. There's different ways we can test it. A lot of test methods are just sliding of two materials against each other, and you might just weigh it afterwards to see how much material it lost. But wear resistance comes into play with cutting, especially if you're slicing abrasive materials, like guys doing rope cutting tests. It's primarily abrasive wear that is leading to sharpness loss. And there's a standardized test called the CATRA test I've done quite a bit of Catra testing where the knife is cut through cardstock, just paper cardstock that has sand in it. And then you measure how much cardstock it's cutting with each slice. And as it gets more dull, it's cutting less each time, and you get a curve for the loss in sharpness over the course of the test.
You just got a new Catra machine, right?
Yeah, I got it.
You.
Yeah, I got it last year or a little more than a year ago. So I was consulting for Buck Knives, and they wanted to pay me money for consulting. And I said, instead of money, maybe you could pay me with your old broken down Catra machine you just replaced. And when I told my wife about this, she was not thrilled.
Right.
I was very excited. I thought she would share in my excitement for sure when I told her I was getting a large piece of equipment to stick in our garage. But
How long
she
you been
wasn't
married?
as excited.
Yeah, well, they don't all share the passion, Larrin.
Yeah, so when you're slicing rope, that's mostly abrasive wear or wear resistance that comes into play. But sometimes you're in kind of gray areas, like cardboard edge retention tests sometimes look a little funny, like they might correlate more with hardness or strength. Like you're seeing some small deformation in the edge that's leading to the dulling rather than abrasion. So different types of media you're cutting, how much of it you're cutting, your edge geometry, that all can change your primary dulling mechanism. You know, you can dull to deformation, you can dull to chipping, you can dull to corrosion, or you can dull to wear. So you know, when you're trying to improve the performance of a knife, you want to see which of those mechanisms are dominating in your cutting. So, you know, you got to look at your edge, and obviously if you're cutting fish in salt water, it may be corrosion. If you're cutting a bunch of rope, it's probably wear. If you're chopping on a cutting board all the time, it may be deformation and or chipping. If you're whittling hard wood, it's probably chipping. So, and then you can adjust your steel choice or your heat treatment choices based on the primary mechanism that you're losing sharpness to. So, should we define strength and hardness?
Yeah.
Since I brought it up.
Do it to it.
Okay. All right. So hardness is a measure of strength. So we can kind of define them at the same time. Strength is just a resistance to permanent deformation. So, you know, if you have your piece of steel or your paper clip, you can bend it a little bit and it'll spring back. If you bend it more, then it won't spring all the way back. You have deformed it to some extent. The same thing can happen with a knife edge, especially a thin knife edge. So the stronger a piece of steel is, the more it can bend and return back. Soft steel, you know, you bend it a little bit and it stays bent. A hard steel, like in a fillet knife, you can bend that 90 degrees and it'll return back to straight because it has enough strength to resist permanent deformation. And so the higher your hardness is, the higher your strength is, the better your resistance to deformation is at the edge. So the edge rolling or taking a divot or something.
Yeah, I think there probably are people who would think, oh, a fillet knife, high hardness, when you can flex it like that, that doesn't make any sense. It seems opposite.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. It happens all the time. Now, some steels are brittle enough where they're too hard, they will snap. Like they just can't handle the flexing. But you need enough strength so that it doesn't stay bent. If your fillet knife stays bent, then you've made a mistake in your heat treating.
Right. So when you're doing tests, I mean, it sounds like some of the tests are tests that you kind of come up with on your own. Maybe I noticed I think you mentioned that Patreon people, you have a pretty heavy following on Patreon, people who support your investigations. Some of the questions maybe come from that community as well. I'm trying to lay out how you decide what to work on with these projects.
Yeah, it's been a little bit haphazard. I mean, it's kind of what I'm interested in at the time, what people will help me with at the time. I've done a bunch of toughness studies, for example, and some of that just depends on who's willing to help me. So some people have heat-treated steel, some people have machined steel. I'll also heat treat a machine steel to test myself, but early on I didn't have the equipment to do that yet. So, if a knife maker will heat treat up a bunch of coupons with different procedures on some A2 steel and send them to me, then, I can test them in a couple hours and write up an article about the results. And so, that's been a big help. My dad did a big study on 5160, he did one on 52100, he did one on Crewforge V. A knife maker named Warren Kryko, he treated just a smattering of a bunch of stuff. Some of it was donated from Alpha Knife Supply, the steel was. And so I've kind of just I've learned a lot just from those experiments. Some of them just repeating stuff you'd think must have been done a billion times by now. I mean, O1 toughness must be characterized by every company by now. But just doing basic heat treatments on basic steels, I learned a lot of very simple things. Maybe they're published in old textbooks somewhere, but some of it is just forgotten, like very simple basic things. Like I assume triple quenching is something that's been tried on different steels at different times, and there's almost nothing published on it when it comes to toughness. And when I first started Knife Steel Nerds, there was almost no toughness data available when it comes to comparing between different companies. So Crucible might have toughness data on some of their steels with their Sharpie C-notch test. Then Udahome will have tests on some of their steels with an unnotched IZOD test, and you can't even compare them.
Right.
And then the companies will have toughness on some of their steels and not on others. And so, people will ask like, well, is AEBL tougher than 52100? And it's like, I don't know, maybe. So that's been a fun project all by itself, just testing the toughness of all these steels. How do they really compare? Like I said, nobody knew what AEBL was a decade or a little more ago. And if people ever did mention it, they're like, oh, it's garbage. It's like 440A or something. And so they definitely wouldn't believe that it has high toughness. Well, AEBL does have a very high toughness and a very fine microstructure. It other qualities that aren't as good as something else, but those properties it definitely has. And so once you test it, then you get more believers.
You wonder how much of the information that you're talking about, like there's stuff that companies publish, obviously, but there has to be a bunch of information that the companies have that isn't in the public domain, either because it just never has been or because of competitive investigation stuff, right? I mean, most companies are at some level involved in testing the other guy's stuff too, right? To make sure that you understand what is everybody else doing. And as a result, like I work in the car industry and we test everybody else's stuff all the time. It's a thing, right? It's part of understanding what the competition's up to. And most of that doesn't get talked about publicly because there's value, right? You might not want to put everything out there in the public.
Yeah, obviously there's not much incentive to publish competitive data when it shows that your competitors have a better product than you do. And sales information is made by salespeople, and so there's also like the game of telephone problem, where you've got the engineers working on it, then sales engineers, and then salespeople. And so by the time the information gets to the salespeople, it's all jumbled up and doesn't make sense anymore. And they're pushing things, and you as the engineer are looking at it like, that's not quite right. I guess we can get away with that if you want to spin it like that. I mean, I wouldn't say it like that. So like there's the game of telephone getting down to sales. And there's also, like you said, just competitive information where they view that as proprietary. We spent a lot of money crashing that car to see how the competitive Ford Focus did against our GM whatever. So yeah, a lot of that doesn't get out. Now, sometimes they don't even test competitor material. It's like, well, why does it matter what they're doing? We're just going to try to sell our stuff regardless. And, I would pester metallurgists all the time, especially from Crucible. They were at most of the shows. So they were my main guys, and they didn't always know. And sometimes they were wrong when they would give me answers. Or, you make assumptions like, oh, the microstructure is finer in this steel versus this one, so I think it would do a little better in this. And then when you test it, it doesn't actually pan out.
Yeah.
And so it takes a lot of experimental work to do all of that. And a lot of times you're focused on other things. They're developing the next product or they're selling the current product, and they just aren't putting in all of the time and resources into that competitive information. So I came in, I tested the toughness, corrosion resistance, edge retention in terms of wear of a whole bunch of steels. I've heat treated tons and tons of them. There's a whole bunch of heat treatment data in the back of my book, for example. So I learned a lot about how the steels actually compared. I had a lot of ideas about where they sat in different areas. I mean, I had memorized the data sheets of tons of these steels because I was so into it. So, I had some intuition about like, oh, this steel is probably a little tougher than this one. This steel should be a lot tougher than that one. This one definitely is more wear resistant. I don't care what these forum guys are saying. There's just no way that this steel could be as super as they're claiming it is. But having some data to back it up, there were still some surprises, some minor and some major. And just doing the experimental work, you learn a lot more than just trying to guess.
Yeah. So I think I had heard or read that in a lot of this testing, like you said, there are many other factors to the story, right? Heat treat, geometry. So when you're doing material investigation, you have to try to take some of those other things out of the picture, right?
Yeah, you want to control as many variables as you can, meaning you're only testing one thing at a time, maybe two things at a time. If you're trying to compare O1 to S30V by purchasing two completely different knives and then cutting rope, you're not comparing O1 and S30V, you're comparing those two knives. So when I do my Catra edge retention testing, every blade is manufactured in the same way with identical edge geometry. I test the sharpness of the knife before it's tested to make sure it's at a certain point or better. Then I repeat the test 3 times to get an average. Just basic experimental things. I'm not doing anything groundbreaking when it comes to basic experimental design. When I'm testing toughness, every steel has the same geometry. So when you're doing the impact testing, you'd imagine the size of the block matters that you're breaking. If you've got a big old chunk of steel, the hammer may not make it through to measure the energy. So you've got to have the same specimen size. I heat treat them in similar ways unless I'm trying to look at a specific thing. Does using slower quench oil lead to better toughness than faster quench oil? That kind of stuff. Does cryo lead to reduced toughness or better toughness? So.
Interesting. Yeah. I think for people that have an engineering background, those are obvious, right? But I think some of that leads to the tribal knowledge stuff that Michael was talking about earlier, where, people draw conclusions when more things have changed than should have, right? To be able to support a clear conclusion, like, oh, this is obviously a better performing material because this knife performs better than that knife. And then quickly gets into the usual engineer questions like, really? Please define what performs means, right? What exactly did you test? How exactly did you measure that? The whole normal list of questions that engineer guys ask.
Yeah, well, and if you're just a normal dude and you get on YouTube and the guy pulls out the knife and he chops a cinder block in half and he says, this just chopped a cinder block in half because I have this special steel, then you as a layperson are just like, wow, that steel must just be really good.
Right.
And you have no way of evaluating like, well, what are all the other things that go into this guy being able to chop a cinder block? And I don't need or want to criticize people doing YouTube testing. Some guys have done a lot of rope or cardboard cutting, and I think all of that testing is great. And I think those guys learn a lot of stuff, especially after a couple years of just testing a whole bunch of knives. They've learned a lot about sharpening and cutting and how much a result can change based on small things that they adjusted. They get better at sharpening and their results are all going up over time, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But people will watch the videos and interpret them wrong, just the same way I just described. Someone sees a Spyderco knife in S30V outcut the Benchmade knife in 154 CM and they immediately think that the S30V is way better. Or they see a nice thin knife in a cheap Chinese steel outcut a more expensive knife in S30V and they're like, oh, this is all a sham, steel doesn't matter. So people will interpret things incorrectly. And that's part of good experimental design, is just knowing what are all the variables I'm changing. And am I interpreting this correctly? You can do a bunch of experiments and they look very impressive to someone that doesn't know. And you're telling them your conclusion, but it could be completely wrong if you don't understand what you're actually testing.
Right. Yeah, at my job, we frequently have situations where someone thinks, well, just go get some data and then we'll know the answer. And the reality is, well, how you got the data matters, where you measured the data matters, the tools you use for the data matter, right? And then even then, there's an interpretation aspect that sometimes gets very challenging, and things are not always as easy as they might seem.
Yeah, experimental design and then analyzing and interpreting the results is, 90% of the work. That
Right.
data generation is the easy part. It might be the time-consuming part, but it's the easy part.
Exactly.
And that's sometimes what's missed by people first getting into some kind of experiments. And even by experienced scientists, you'll see controversies or disagreements between scientists where they'll publish a paper, like eating chocolate chip cookies makes you lose weight. And other scientists will be like, are you serious? Did you see how you set up this experiment?
Right.
Where you were giving them cookies made with no sugar and that's the only thing they could eat, and you were comparing against general population. What do you think this was going to tell you? And so those things all matter, and people will do experiments and like, well, my hypothesis wasn't correct, but if I look at all the data, I see a tiny trend line with this one factor I never considered, but it must be true because I'm seeing it here. And they'll publish that. But, if you do an experiment and look at 100 variables, you'll find one with a trend line.
Yes.
And it may not be a real trend line. If you did the experiment all over again, it would just be noise again.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Well, so you have the website. The website was intended to be your online collection of articles, kind of reference material that gets built over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you also wrote the book. So how did the book come about? Like, how does it fit into your sphere of material?
Yeah, initially I did the website kind of instead of the book. Like, I knew about Dr. Verhoeven's book and I thought it was great. And I thought, well, I could write a book too, from a kind of different angle or cover different things. But then I thought, oh, well, the website, I can just publish articles for free. Anyone can read them. Like, I'll do this website instead. I don't have to spend 2 years on a book. I can just publish an article a week or every other week. And, just as I learn, people will learn, and I can put out articles and adjust as things come up. What people find interesting, I can write an article about it. And so I never considered the book because, I'm publishing all this information for free. Why would anyone buy a book? But more and more people were asking me for a book. And the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea, because I would write an article on something. I'd write an article about 5200 steel. And then I would write about austenitizing the steel. And I'm like, oh, dang it. I can't write what austenitizing is in this article on 5200, because then I'd have to write about tempering and cryo and what toughness is and what edge retention is. I have to define a million things in this article. I just need to write about 5200. And so I'd link to an article like about austenitizing in the austenitizing section on 5200. But I'd look at my website data and no one's clicking on these links. So either they already know it, or people will get to a 5200 article. Someone post to Facebook about heat treating 5200. They're like, oh man, you need to go read the Knife Steel Nerds article. It's all there, bro. And then they click on it and they're like, this was way too complicated for me. I don't even know what he's talking about. So, and that'd be frustrating to me because I work so hard to make it as simple as I can, but I just can't include everything in every article. So the solution seemed to be a book. The book I can write from the very basics all the way up to advanced topics. And as long as they read it generally in order or only skip the chapters that they actually know already, they'll be able to follow it all the way through. And so I started on the book. There's a lot of crossover information with the website. I rewrote everything. It's in a different format. It's on paper. People read differently on paper than they do on the internet. And yes. It's been a big success. Everybody seems to love the book. The reviews are great on Amazon. Lots of people that didn't even know about my website are starting out with the book. And I'm sure there's some people that still think it's hard to understand, but the feedback I've gotten is great. Everybody tells me that it's easy to understand. The people that post randomly on the internet without thinking I'll read it also say it's easy to understand. So I'm very pleased with how it turned out. I can't believe how positive the reaction has been, because I've had my trolls here or there. I thought for sure there'd be a troll army ready to criticize me for just taking my website information and trying to sell it in a book. And it hasn't happened. And I think it's because the book is high quality. I mean, I worked very hard on it, and it shows. People are really enjoying it. So the book has been great.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, I use it quite a bit. It's a really good read. I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Yeah, same here. I keep it around handy, and I'll just open it up and start reading randomly now that I've already, read through it once, and just,
I keep it on my heat treating bench. It's right there handy as a reference.
There you go.
I keep it next to me too, because I forget everything. So the nice thing about having a book is everything that I once knew is in there.
So people can find the book on Amazon. It sounds like you just mentioned it, or direct through the website, or where should people go to get the book if they don't have it and want it?
Yeah, Amazon's the best place to get it. It's called Knife Engineering. You can also buy it from Blade HQ if you don't like Amazon. If you're in Australia, you should buy it from Gameco. So if you're in Australia, you know what Gameco is probably. But Amazon's the easiest place to buy it.
We have kind of the Mark of the Maker Army is probably like 11 people, but we have a lot of book people that follow the show, so I think they'll really appreciate being able to go grab that.
Good.
Well, very interesting. What, Tom, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so I assume you want to talk about it, the new steel you've been working on specifically for knife makers, something totally different.
Yep. It's called CPM MagnaCut. So MAGNA.
Oh, sweet name.
It's an homage to a company called Vasco. And they had a whole series of high-speed steels with cut in the name, like Hypercut, Red Cut, Gray Cut. I don't even remember them all. So I like those names because they have cut in it. And that's also what we do with knives, is cut with them.
Yep.
Vasco doesn't really exist anymore, but they've had a big impact also on the knife industry, believe it or not. So CPM Crewware and Z-Ware, those are popular steels now. Those came from Vasco Ware, developed by Vasco.
Oh, okay.
Vasco developed M4 way back in the day. CPM M4 is still pretty popular. Little known is that CPM 3V, the composition was not developed by Crucible. It is Vasco die produced by Powder Metallurgy. It's a little bit surprising they were able to patent CPM 3V because the composition is identical to Vasco die, which was previously patented. But because it made enough change in the properties, they were able to patent the Powder Metallurgy version of Vasco die.
Check that out.
So Vasco, they were really big in like the early to mid 1900s. They had a big impact on the steel industry. They were cutting edge for a long time. They were basically swallowed up by larger companies, and they don't really exist anymore. So yeah, that's too big of a tangent on the name, but the name is MagnaCut. And it's designed to have properties as good as a powder metallurgy non-stainless steel, but while being stainless. So the properties are similar to CPM 4V or CPM Crewware, which have a really good balance of toughness and edge retention.
Interesting.
What level of corrosion resistance is it going to have?
The corrosion resistance is one of the biggest surprises, actually. It was designed to be similar to other steels like S35VN or S30V, but the corrosion resistance ended up being a lot better than I expected. So it's not as good as the super saltwater steels like H1 or LC200N or VanX, but it's just a step below those. It's better than S30V. It's better than M390, 20CV, S90V, S110V. It's a little bit better than all of those. The steel was designed to be different than any previous stainless. because stainless steels all have chromium carbides in them. You add a bunch of chromium to steel with carbon in it, and it wants to form chromium carbide. And chromium carbides, they want to be bigger than vanadium carbides in a powder metallurgy steel. They're also softer than vanadium carbides. And so the best non-stainless powder metallurgy steels are alloyed with vanadium. Trying to think of simple ways to explain this, but the vanadium carbides are harder. So for a given amount of carbide, you have more wear resistance. And the more carbide you have, the lower your toughness is. So if you can have the same level of wear resistance with less carbide, then you get a higher combination of toughness and wear resistance. Because normally those two factors are opposed to each other. You can have CPM 15V with stellar edge retention and kind of poor toughness, or you can have CPM 1V or 3V with really high toughness but not as high edge retention. But you can't have them both at the same time. You can't have the ultra wear resistance, ultra toughness steel. So when you have chromium carbides, your toughness edge retention balance is lower because you're not getting as much edge retention for your amount of carbide. So this is why D2 is never going to be as good as CPM 10V or Venatus 8 or CPM 4V because it's made up of chromium carbide. It'll be easier to grind and sharpen on soft abrasives because those chromium carbides are softer than the abrasive, but the properties themselves are better if you can have a small carbide structure like in a powder metallurgy steel with just vanadium carbides. So the new steel is unique in that it's a stainless steel with no chromium carbide in it after it's been heat treated. It's got the same structure as a non-stainless powder metallurgy steel like 4V or CPM crew wear. And those steels are really popular in a wide range of knives. Like CPM 4V is used a lot in the competition chopping knives for its good toughness and edge retention. CPM crew wear and Z wear is used in a lot of thin cutting knives and folders because you can take a tough steel and put it in a thin edge with a good level of hardness and it'll outcut anything else because the best way to make a superior cutting knife is just to make it thin. It's not just about the steel or the heat treatment. It's just making it thin. If it's thinner, it cuts better, it cuts longer, as long as you're not deforming or chipping. So if you've got a high toughness, high hardness steel that resists deformation, that resists chipping, then it'll cut a long time. So CPM 4V crew wear and now this new steel MagnaCut are really in what I think is the sweet spot, where it's got about double or more the toughness of our common powder metallurgy stainless steels now, like CPM 154, S35VN, S30V, M390. It's double or better the toughness of those steels with a similar level of edge retention and also stellar corrosion resistance. So I'm really excited with how the steel has ended up. I agonized over the steel for over a year. I designed it on paper, but didn't know how it was going to do until we actually made some and tested it. And so I got Crucible Steel and Niagara Specialty Metals on board with my idea. I pitched to them, I've got this composition that I designed on paper. I think it's going to work. So will you spend a whole bunch of money and time on it and see if it will work? And I convinced them.
Wow.
So they made some, and all the testing has been as good or better than I hoped. So I've really come out looking good after this. So hopefully not too good, but well, hopefully we can even make more steels maybe further in the future. But I picked this property range because it's really what I think is the golden area where you're really getting a good combination of properties.
Larrin, is this MagnaCut? Where does the Magna come from?
Yeah, Magna is just the Latin word like for great or awesome. So there was Hypercut from Vasco, and Crucible, the trademark lawyer, told me that we were not going to be able to use the same name even though the trademark had expired because it was being used by like a saw company or something. The name was. And he's like, that's not going to fly. So I'm like, well, what are all the other superlative terms I can stick in front of cut? And Magna was the one I ended up with.
Nice.
So, Larrin, I'm curious, if it doesn't use chromium for corrosion resistance, is it a nitrogen steel?
It's got a little bit of nitrogen in it, but adding a large amount of nitrogen is expensive. And so I really wanted to design the steel so it could be produced just with typical powder metallurgy production. And so, we force a little bit of nitrogen into it with typical methods, but it gets a corrosion resistance from chromium. It's just balanced right so that all of that chromium carbide gets dissolved. All of the chromium is put in solution, it's called,
Right.
during
There's
the
no
heat
excess.
treatment stage.
No excess to form the chromium carbides.
Yeah, so like in a steel, if we talk about carbon chromium balance a little bit, so like 440C, it's got 1% carbon and 18% chromium, or maybe 17%. And it doesn't have all of that carbon and chromium in solution. It makes a bunch of carbide with all of that. AEBL, it's got like 0.7, 0.65 carbon and 13 or 12.8 chromium. And it's balanced on that line so that if you heat it up to 2,000 degrees, most of that carbide dissolves. And so you have to balance your carbon and chromium to get the carbide to dissolve and not make a bunch of excess chromium carbide. And for some reason in the past, the metallurgists have just not thought to reduce the carbon and chromium to try to eliminate the chromium carbide. There's some kind of hurdle that they couldn't jump over mentally. I'm not sure why. There hasn't been a lot of development of stainless tool steels in the past, so maybe there just wasn't enough drive for excellence or something. But if you reduce the chromium content enough and then balance it with carbon, then you can get all the chromium carbide to dissolve when you heat treat. And you have to set that based on what temperature you're going to harden it at. And then you replace it with some other carbide type. Because if you dissolve all of your carbide, then your grain size will blow up because there's no more carbides to pin the grains. And when you get large grains, then your toughness goes down. So the steel is designed to have vanadium and niobium carbides and to dissolve all the chromium carbide. But to answer your question, there is chromium in the steel. That's where it gets the corrosion resistance.
Very cool.
Is there a specific application that it's really targeted for, Larrin, or is it intended to be a universal cutlery steel, or is it really designed for a slice of the industry?
Yeah, it was designed to be pretty general purpose. Like I mentioned, 4V is used in competition choppers and in thin cutting knives. And so when you get a steel that's nicely balanced, not too high on the end of toughness or on wear resistance, you can adjust the heat treatment for the different type of knife. So for a competition chopper, you want to go into the 60 to 62 Rockwell range. For a thin slicing knife, you can be more like in 61 to 63. Or if you've got good customers, you can even push it a little higher. So if you want it to cut longer, you can go a bit higher on hardness. If you want more toughness, you can go a bit lower on hardness. And so I also did some different hardness experiments, different heat treating experiments to dial that in a little bit and provide specific recommendations on the heat treatment. But the steel is pretty easy to heat treat, and I think it'll work well in factory knives and with custom makers. The main hurdle it'll have with custom makers is how lazy you guys are with finishing. And vanadium carbide steels are harder to finish. They just are. Now, MagnaCut does have very small carbides, which helps with finishing. So I've heard it's easier to finish than some other steels like S35VN or S30V, for example, but it's not going to be quite as easy as CPM 154. Belt finishes are probably going to be better. So hand rub finishes, if you've got experience with steels like S35VN or S30V, then this will be easy. But if you've only used CPM 154, it'll be more challenging. And then forging bladesmiths, they like really simple steels, and this steel isn't going to change their mind. So I'd say stock removal makers, production makers, everything, folders, kitchen knives, choppers, it's pretty versatile in that way.
Okay. It seems like I saw some pictures from your father where he had made some kitchen knives that used it as the core in some sandmai or something, or did I make that up?
No, he did that. I mean, he can forge weld anything. So, if there's a guy to do it, he can do it. So the initial steel has been produced and samples have been sent to some knife makers. We also sent some to Peter's Heat Treating to see how it responds to vacuum furnaces as opposed to heat treating, in a small furnace and plate quenching or something, which is normally what I do. And, I give instructions to knife makers that are often using a similar process, but
right.
So we sent samples of those knife makers to get their feedback. That's how I know what people are saying about how it's finishing and sharpening. And the feedback is really good. I mean, the guys that use high alloy steels with vanadium, they're saying it finishes really easy. The guys with CPM 154 say it doesn't finish easy. And but everybody's saying it sharpens really well. They really like how it cuts. They found it pretty easy to work. It grinds easy, despite how it can be more difficult to finish sometimes. So yeah, all the reports getting back, guys have done rope cutting tests, cardboard cutting tests, chopping tests. Everybody's saying that it's performing, just how it should based on the more controlled experiments that I do. So those knife makers that have been trying it out are all loving it, and the feedback is really good. It's really exciting. I mean, even when you do your basic tests like toughness and corrosion resistance and wear resistance, there's always a little worry in the back of your mind, like maybe this looks good on paper, but once somebody uses it, they're going to find some weird flaw, and that hasn't come up, fortunately.
Excellent.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
So what is the most important customer thing, Larrin? Your dad. That's the real verdict, man. That one has to be a clincher. I'm like, oh, God, what is he going to say?
Yeah, my dad loves it. And of course, my dad's very proud of me. He's proud to have a son who's a PhD metallurgist and doing well with designing steel and writing a book and the website. So he's very proud. He's very happy with the steel. He's excited. He's my biggest cheerleader. Every time a knife maker calls him now, he says that they need to call up Niagara and ask for some MagnaCut, even though you can't buy any yet. So,
that's fantastic.
But yeah, that's one of the cool aspects that, I have somebody to call and talk to about what's going on. I don't just have random internet friends that I don't really know. I have my dad, and he's there reading my articles, and, he helped edit my book, and he's one of the early testers of my steel, and he's always there supporting me and telling everyone how smart I am.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's the one, at least if your dad's like my dad, the one thing I can absolutely 100% count on him for is honesty and unafraid to bust my chops if I get it wrong or if he disagrees. He is not shy, and that I thank him for that, right? I didn't always thank him for that, but I do anymore for sure.
Yeah, it's been great.
Very cool. Oh, that's an awesome story, Larrin. We've burned through some time here. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about as far as things you have coming up? Or, we hit the website and the book and the new steel, which is pretty awesome for the industry. It's cool to see another knife or a cutlery focused steel out there. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and that's something I've thought about a little bit is what does it mean to be a steel designed just for knives? Because, some steels designed for knives don't seem that well optimized for it, and some steels made for something completely different are pretty well suited for knives. So it's kind of a dubious thing to say sometimes about certain steels. It's good marketing, but this steel, it was only designed for knives. That's the only thing I thought about. There's always people that are like, oh, S30V, it was actually designed for plastics industry and they just shoehorned it into knives. No, it's not true. And MagnaCut was the same way. If anything, Crucible is not that happy. I want to call it MagnaCut because they will want to try to push it to other industries, and having cut in the name doesn't make that much sense.
Yeah, there you go.
But I designed it for knife makers. I made it exactly how I wanted. I think it's perfect. I think it's very well designed for knives. But there are competing things. Some people want more wear resistance. Some people want more toughness. You can design it for custom knife makers with small furnaces, but it does also need to be heat treatable at the bigger companies with vacuum furnaces. So it does end up being a little more broad than if you just had one guy in mind.
Those people wanting other stuff that just lets you design other steels.
Yeah, I'd love to design some more, but I'm going to stay focused on MagnaCut for now. And, we'll make the more corrosion resistant version, the more wear resistant version. If it's a big success, I'm sure Crucible will be ready for more. So everybody go out and buy MagnaCut, and then we'll have even more options.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that's really cool. That's a pretty awesome personal milestone, right? To have your name really behind that whole thing. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And like I said, my dream from the beginning, was driven by stuff like S30V that, developing the new knife steel, that was my dream. I mean, writing Knife Steel Nerds and knife engineering, those are things I enjoy doing. But what was my dream? It was developing new steels for knives. And so this is really the culmination of everything I've been working towards. And I can't tell you how excited I am.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I think that's a good spot to wrap it up. Larrin, we'd love to have you back sometime, maybe when we get a little more experience with it in the field, or if we have another topic we can put together. It'd be a fun conversation to have you join us sometime in the future. So,
yeah, we mostly talked about me today, but obviously I can talk all about any subject related to steel or heat treating that you want. So if you get some listener questions or problems or something, I'm ready.
Yeah, that'd be cool. A little Q&A with Larrin would be pretty neat.
Yep.
All right. Well, cool. So we have a much smaller number of people who support us on Patreon as well. So high five to our Patreon supporters, all the people that help keep the podcast going and are very kind and generous every month to send us a few bucks. We really appreciate that. We have a Facebook group that is really focused on the show, and it's a really, really fun place to, when we do history episodes or even interviews and makers talk about their early work and some other stuff. It's been a really nice place to share information and pictures and chat outside the show. This has been a real pleasure for us with the absence of knife shows over the last year. It's been kind of a blessing for us to be able to get together every couple weeks and chat knives and nerd out over knife stuff when normally we would do that at shows and we aren't able to do it. So it's been really cool for us to be able to get back together, and the Facebook group is sort of a virtual way to do some of that as well. So thanks to everybody that supports us and participates in the Facebook group. I think that's it, fellas. You guys have any other last second questions before we wrap it?
I don't think so.
I don't have a question. I did want to mention, guys, check out his website. He does have a Patreon also. Helps get that information out, and for sure get the book.
Yeah, knifesteelnerds.com, and the book on Amazon, right, Larrin?
Yep.
Yeah, the book's on Amazon. Patreon is great, as you guys know. All of that money goes towards the steel research itself. I have a full-time job. I don't need more money. The money is so that my wife doesn't get mad at me when I buy more heat treating furnaces.
That is important.
Yes. Yeah.
Go support Mark of the Maker too on Patreon. Just when you have regular income coming in, it's just a lot easier to have reliable money coming in, so you can pay for those hosting fees and things, as opposed to sometimes a guy will email you and say, "Hey, I really love what you're doing. Can I give you $20?" And you're like, "Yes, that would help me, but if I got $2 every month, that'd be even more helpful."
Absolutely. Yep. Very well said. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us, Larrin.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you. The pleasure was ours.
Thank you.
Thanks, Larrin.
I think that's it. And thanks everybody for listening along with us. We look forward to your feedback, and we'll talk to you next time.
Cue the music.
To learn more about our makers, you can find Tom Crine on the web at crineknives.net, in his Facebook group, Crine Knives, or in his Instagram account, @CrineKnives. For Michael Birch, check birchtreeblades.com, Facebook group Birch Tree Blade Works, or Michael's Instagram @BirchtreeBlades. For myself and the Raygun Bead Project, we're on the web at raygundivision.com. We have a Facebook group called Raygun Division, or my personal Instagram @msteiner. For those interested in photos, references from the show, or some discussion about the show itself, you can find us on the web at markofthemaker.com, in a Facebook group called Mark of the Maker, or on our Instagram @markofthemaker. Last but not least, the ultra cool and haunting background music we use for the show is a piece called Noir Guitar by Stevie's Amp Shack, found at the Free Music Archive and licensed under Creative Commons CC BY 4.0. Thanks for listening.